Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and in advance of calving season, I'm joined by Teagasc Head of Dairy, Patton, to find out how to manage cow nutrition in the crucial weeks pre and post calving. Joe, you're very welcome. Mineral supplementation prior to calving is essential. Why are minerals so critical now?
So for minerals, obviously what we need minerals to really deliver for us is a trouble-free calving, I suppose, and also a healthy cow and a healthy calf at the end of the process of late pregnancy and calving and into early lactation or into early life for the animal. It is a stressful period of the most stressful period of the animal's life. So it's important that we have them well set up from a health and immunity point of view. So that's really what we want the minerals to deliver for us. Okay, so look, really, I always sort of look at it this way, and it's an easy way to look at it, I suppose, is that we really have two main groups of minerals, if you like. You've got your big chunky macro minerals, so your things like magnesium and phosphorus, for example, and then you also have your trace minerals, which would be things like zinc and copper and those kind of ones. And while there's a difference in, let's say, the rates or the scale of each of those minerals and the type of minerals, they do each perform a very important function or a specific function. So, I would always look at it. The macro minerals gets the cow over calving and into a good start. And the trace minerals then are really for particular health and immunity functions as well. So there's a lot going on in there. But look, if we keep it simple and say, look, we've got our macro minerals and we've got our trace minerals, and getting those right are really what we need to do for cow and calf alike,
And when farmers come to pick the right mineral, what's important to ensure that the correct minerals and vitamins are in the pre-calver at the correct rate?
Yeah, look, this is, there's, yourself, like you'd see when you go into the store or you go in looking for minerals, there's all sorts of different lotions and potions, I suppose, and all sorts of different means of feeding them, either boluses or buckets or, and it becomes very confusing maybe when you're not looking at it all the time, maybe you're only looking at it once or twice a year. But really what we're saying is we need to just come back and say, right, we need a certain level of the right minerals, no matter what way they're delivered. Okay, so don't worry about the color on the bucket, or don't worry about all the talk around it. It's really look at the levels of mineral in the bucket, if you like, and say, if we can get those right, we're happy enough. So let's just, for example, take the macro minerals, right? So the big chunky macro minerals, like really the ones I'd be pointing people towards there is certainly magnesium and phosphorus. So for magnesium anyway, for a suckler cow, we want sort of 20% magnesium in the mix. So that's about 20%. So we're assuming our animal is eating about 100 grams of mineral at that. So we want 20 grams of additional magnesium delivered. So a 20% mineral for magnesium would be a good starting point. And on the phosphorus side, maybe something 3-4% phosphorus included. Now, when you look at your label, Catherine, they'll be on the top of the label and they'll be very clear. So you're looking for a percentage there that says at least 20% magnesium and probably something like 3 or 4% phosphorus. If you hit those as a starting point, those are very good. That'll be an assistance for the animal, for the cow to calve cleanly and to have a good muscle function, etc., while they're calving. And obviously, we don't want any calcium added pre-calving, so that's why we wouldn't use a post-calving mineral for a pre-calving cow. The main difference is the calcium. We don't want any added calcium pre-calving, but we do want it post-calving. So if you just think of those two as a starting point, the 20% and the 3 or 4% for magnesium and phosphorus, respectively, would be the important ones. Now, on the trace element side, it becomes quite, there's an awful lot of moving parts on the trace element side. So really, I'll just sort of say, like, effectively what you're looking for to make sure is that you've got good levels of copper, selenium, iodine, cobalt, manganese, and zinc. So those would be the ones, and they're generally going to be included in all your mixes. Okay. Now, I suppose just to point out that those all have their own different functions. So everybody's probably fairly familiar with copper. People tend to focus a lot on copper and what it looks like in terms of rough coats and, ill thrift and that kind of thing. But just remember, like something for copper, what we want to do is, for example, is we want to meet the requirements for the animal and move on, really. Like you don't get a big response to feeding more and more over and above what the animal needs. So look at from a dry cow point of view, something in the region of 300 milligrams per copper per day, for example, is where you need to go. But there is the issue then of whether it's whether it's protected copper or protected trace elements versus not, So look, that sounds all very complicated. So just remember, I suppose we get into the differences into trace elements in a minute, but your big ones is kind of mag and phosphorus at 20% and 3 to 4%. And then your list of your micros, which is your copper, selenium, iodine, cobalt, manganese, zinc. If they're all present, you're off to a good start.
That's right, Joe. And I suppose a lot of minerals are indirectly related to a deficiency in one could reduce the efficacy of another element. What should farmers be aware of?
The big things here is we have to look at minerals too, that we are, the ones I've mentioned there, we are supplementing those in so that we're adding those to the diet, okay? They're going into the diet. But one of the things that can happen is that there might be high levels of other minerals in your silage or in your feed that can have a negative effect on how well the animal uses the minerals that you're adding into the mix. So the classic one there, obviously, again, is copper. So, for example, we could be feeding a reasonable level of a standard formulation for all your trace elements. But if you've got very high iron content, if you've got very high molybdenum content, you've got very high sulfur content, and maybe aluminium as well, but particularly say iron, sulfur, and molybdenum in combination. In that circumstance, what you might end up having a situation where your trace elements aren't absorbed as well as they should be. So while we are feeding enough of them, if you've got all these antagonistic minerals, we call them, in the background, they can interfere with the absorption of the mineral, and that causes a problem. Now, I know myself from over the years, there's an awful lot of times you hear people talking about they have this problem on farm. But sometimes when you measure it from, let's say, taking a silage sample or taking a feed sample, it's probably overstated, maybe, I would say, overall, that there's not as much of that antagonism as what people might perceive. I think sometimes, we have to measure it and look at what the mineral levels are in the silage before we just assume that there's a problem like that, if you know what I'm saying. So my advice would be, if you think you have an antagonistic problem on the farm, test your silage for mineral content and speak to your advisor then, because there's no point in just assuming that the issue is there. Now, how do you counteract it if you do have it, or what's the best way to counteract it? The best way to counteract that, I suppose, is to feed maybe protected sources. So protected sources of your trace minerals, so your chelated minerals. So, for example, you take something like copper or zinc or selenium. They can come in different forms, Catherine. You can have a very sort of simple mineral type standard. So like copper oxide, for example, which is a very cheap and cheerful, I suppose, source of copper. You have to feed a lot of that for it to be absorbed because it's absorbed quite low efficiency of absorption. But if you have a lot of these antagonists, it's very prone to getting locked up. Whereas if you're feeding protected mineral sources, so your chelated minerals, for example, they will bypass that problem to a large extent. So they don't get locked up in the room and they move through the animal to the intestine and they're absorbed there. So what I'm saying is, if there's a history of trace element problems on the farm, or there's issues like that, the thing to do is test your mineral content in your silage to see, have you got antagonists on the farm, number one, and number two, then move to maybe having at least sort of 30%, 40% of the total mineral content of those trace minerals, have them in protected form. Okay, now, how do you see that? If you're looking at the bag, or you're looking at the spec that you're looking at, you'll see things like chelated mentioned, or it'd be chelated or protected or organic sources of the trace elements. And as I say, if they're included, if there's a range of those different types of ingredients included, the chances are that that's going to help you get over any of those antagonist problems.
That's great, Joe. You mentioned earlier the ways of supplementing minerals, be it bolus or dusting or buckets. Which is best, do you think, or is there a difference?
go back to maybe what we're trying to achieve is important to say, right? So we mentioned earlier on that you've got you have your macro minerals and then you have your trace minerals, right? The macro minerals, remember, are fed in grams per day. That's grams per day. So take something like magnesium, for example. I said earlier on, we need to feed about 20 grams per cow per day. Now, to feed that, you're going to have to feed something. For example, if that comes in as CalMag or calcine magnesite, you'll have to feed about 40 grams of CalMag to get that amount of magnesium into your cow every day. Over even a 40-day dry period, that's 1.5, 1.6 kilograms of CalMag that you'll end up feeding. Okay, which is a big chunky amount of stuff, if you know what I mean. That's before you count the phosphorus and the sodium. So like you think about it, I always say to people like this way, look at, if you buy your trace mineral, if you buy your minerals in loose form or in bag form, it comes on a pallet because it's so bulky. You cannot replace everything that happens on that in those bags out of a single bolus. A bolus comes in a box, it's small. All that is in the bolus is the trace mineral part, which is your copper, selenium, iodine, manganese, those type of ones. They're needed in milligrams per day, which is, you think about this, there's 1,000 milligrams in a gram, so there's 1,000,000 milligrams in a kilo. So they're tiny, tiny quantities that they're needed in, so they'll fit in a bolus. But your big chunky, your magnesium, phosphorus, and sodium, those type of ones, they're needed in chunky quantities that you basically buckets of it per day, if you like, right? And I think if we can get people to understand that a little bit, that you cannot replace all the function of the macro minerals out of a single bolus. That's important to say, right? So, for example, if you said you wanted to go with a bolus for your trace minerals, you would still be dusting CalMag and phosphorus onto the silage or in the water. Or indeed, if you just go with the dusted mineral, it should cover it all. So I would say certainly for dry cows, my preference is always the dusted bag mineral because it covers everything. If you want to use trace minerals or boluses when animals are on pasture, they might come into their own out there. It's simpler to do, but certainly the dusted mineral would be the preference for me anyway. I think the buckets are popular because it seems like you don't have to do much with them, and some people get on well with them, and that's fine. The issue with buckets always is, are all animals getting the same level? Because a few dominant cows could take over on the buckets, if you like, and take more than their share. That's why I would say that it's hard to beat 100 grams of a dusted mineral every day for about 6 weeks before the cows start to calve. And I think that covers an awful lot.
Yeah, I suppose at least at that stage, Joe, that they're all getting it.
Yeah, and look, it's a thing, you're probably in the shed anyway. It's a 2-minute job every day. It's sort of, it's not a big deal in terms of labor. It's, if you're checking through the stock, it's just as easy to throw a bit of mineral in front of them as you're checking them, and that's the job done. And it's kind of distributed through the silage or whatever, and each cow is more likely to get what they need. But don't rely on the boluses in a pre-calving situation, is what I'd be saying.
I suppose finally, Joe, what 2 or 3 tips have you for farmers in relation to the nutrition and mineral supplementation post-calving? I suppose some cows might be housed for a couple of weeks now if they're starting calving at the end of January or early days of February.
The big thing there is, I suppose, we didn't mention it at all, but silage quality. If we have some quality silage or quality bales kept aside for the post-calving, obviously the demand of the cow increases after calving. So, milk production, even though it's at a low level, still requires quite a bit of energy. So a couple of kilos of good quality concentrate and higher quality silage post-calving. Mineralized concentrate would do. So if there's minerals included in it, maybe at a 2-3 kilo rate, something like that, depending on your silage quality, just to ensure that your cows are producing adequate milk is important. So look at, I know on a lot of farms, we've said this a number of times over the years, Catherine, that the quality of silage is all the same, if you like, and what's suitable for a dry cow from a silage point of view may not be suitable for a milking cow. So you want some leafy silage, kind of high, low mid 70s at least, with some mineralized concentrate on top. Now, the concentrate, if you buy it sort of a lactating ration, it will have higher levels of calcium and phosphorus than the dry cow mineral, and that should keep them fine. That's certainly the would be the advice. So keep some of your best silage aside for that time of the year. One other thing I suppose I didn't mention is just on the minerals, pre-calving really, is that, oftentimes we see that the major problem, or the source of the problem on a lot of farms, is not just the spec of the mineral. So it's the rate at which it's fed, or the frequency with which it's fed. So I would be suggesting that, making sure that you're feeding enough per day, or the right amount per day, it's just as important as, what the label says. So for example, if you've got 30 cows, if you've 30 dry cows, for example, all on minerals, they should be eating 3 kilos of 30 by 10, or 30 by 100 is 3 kilos of mineral per day, roughly. So you could say that, your bag of mineral in that situation should be doing you just about a week, or a little bit, maybe a week or thereabouts. Working it out that way to know, am I going through the mineral fast enough is important as well, Catherine. So no point in having a very high spec mineral and it's sitting in the bag for too long.
That's great, Joe. Thanks very much. Some great tips and advice.
Okay, thanks, Catherine.
That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to Joe for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.